All right, so this is chapter 13. We're finishing up our last unit. Chapter 13 is the beginning of unit 4, and so we are almost done. So, woohoo, celebrate. Oh my gosh, semester's almost over. Hope you guys are excited about that as I am. This particular chapter is cover Western expansion, manifest destiny, stuff you learned in 8th grade, and then it's going to eventually end with the Mexican-American War. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so Harrison was elected last time we talked. He beat Mark Van Buren, but he's the oldest man, and he actually dies within the first 30 days in office. It's pretty interesting how he catches pneumonia from giving a speech, his inauguration speech in March in D.C. He gets really cold, but he refuses to wear a jacket and catches pneumonia and ultimately dies from it. But the big takeaway here, when he dies, his vice president takes over, John Tyler, right? Tyler is different. Tyler is not a typical Whig like Harrison that believes in the national bank, supports internal improvement, nationalist. No, Tyler is a Whig in name, but he almost sounds like a Democrat in that he believes states actually have rights to nullify. He actually thinks this is okay. No other president ever would say, yeah, sure, states can nullify. No, but he will. He'd be one of the few presidents that actually believe that. He denies Henry Clay's third bank. He gets rid of the independent treasury. He doesn't believe in any of that stuff, any large federal government. It gets so bad, his entire Whig cabinet will resign. All but one, his Secretary of State, who will then resign a little bit later, nonetheless. Because he does all this, essentially Tyler will be known as a man with no party, meaning the Whigs kicked him out. He was a president, but he did not have a political party. He's the only one like that. Throughout U.S. history. Things that go through Tyler's administration he does have to deal with. First thing, he has a problem with the British almost immediately. Quick background, Great Britain had outlawed ships with slaves in 1807. Right? We outlawed the international slave trade in 1808. They are going to actually get rid of all slavery in their colonies in 1834. Far, far, far ahead of the United States. But here lies a problem. If you actually look at this map, you'll see the domestic slave trade, the one within inside of the United States, was ongoing. Some of the first slaves populations, major areas were in Virginia and South Carolina. But as generations have gone by, we've seen tobacco is not growing in Virginia as well. So there is less and less need for slaves. As a matter of fact, a lot of people from Virginia are selling off their slaves. Out of every 3 slaves that actually were sent from Virginia to these new cotton growing southern areas. For every 3, 2 of them were just there just to be sold. That's it. Only 1/3 of them actually were there to work with the same slave owner. That's how fast they're getting rid of slavery in other places of the world, or other places in the United States, but just moving it over to more cotton growing regions. But one thing you don't know, or might not know, is that off the coastline, within 90 miles south of Florida is like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a lot of other states. But there are small islands, or Puerto Rico soon be a state maybe. There are small islands off the side here in international water that these ships would pass by, and they're called the Bahamas. And the Bahamas at the time are a group of islands, and they're owned by the British. Now the British have outlawed slavery. So on this trek, the Creole, this ship, has a slave rebellion. The slave owners and traders are killed, slave traders navigating a ship are killed, murdered, and these slaves will dock at the Bahamas, and the British government will have to decide, hey, these slaves just committed murder. Now, wait a second. They did this in international water, and they're landing in a colony that does not have slavery, so they're not slaves anymore. As a matter of fact, they fought for their slavery, or for their freedom. So these slaves are not slaves, and they're free because they're in the Bahamas, but also they actually did not commit murder when they rose against their captives. They are actually fighting for their own freedom. It's kind of like if you got kidnapped, fought and killed your captive, you're not going to get tried for murder. It's self-defense, right? And that's what the British government decided. The British government said, no, they weren't slaves. They're fighting for their freedom. They're illegally slaves at all because they're international waters, and that's the agreement you have gone by. You agreed to back in 1808. But so what happens is the British are going to set these slaves free. All but 3 women and 2 children are going to be that refuse to leave the ship, are going to be sent over to the South, and the South is pissed. They want compensation. They want the British to pay for their slaves. They say, hey, that's our property. You can't just get rid of it like that. And the British are going to say, it's not your property. They're people. They're no longer your property. They're freed from slavery. So you can imagine the whole South is upset about this in the United States. The South declares war. They want to go to war, all kinds of stuff. They hate the British. Tyler has to deal with that. And this probably makes no sense at all to you, and it shouldn't, because it's not the most logical thing. But nonetheless, the British and Americans get together, and they're going to negotiate a treaty. That treaty is here, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. Well, first they start negotiating a few things. Say, okay, we're both going to agree we're going to do better to check for joint effort to check for slave trade. America's got to help out with that. And that's step 1. However, the next part does nothing to do with the Creole ship or slavery at all. Instead, they seem to shift their focus to the north, where they have these disputes about the border with Canada, and they settle that instead. And that's what comes to a treaty. If that doesn't make sense, how you go from a slave ship rebelling and compensation for the slaves to a simple treaty about a border in Canada, if it doesn't make sense, you're right, it doesn't. People in the South are still upset, and eventually 9 years later, the British will pay for those slaves, but the British end up meeting with Americans, and this is what comes up of it. All right, this term actually might bring you back to 8th grade, manifest destiny. It started off as newspaper propaganda that was printed and spread widely. But the idea was that it was the United States' right by manifest destiny to overspread and possess the whole continent, which Providence has given us for development of the great experiment of liberty and federal self-government entrusted to us. Essentially, this is saying God, being Providence, believes that the United States should spread from coast to coast and even beyond if necessary. And while starting off as a mere newspaper editorial, it caught on really well and became the nationwide sentiment, is that we need to spread and take more land. We have every right to do so. It's our destiny ordained by God himself or herself. What I do like to pay attention to is this painting of manifest destiny here. It's pretty interesting. This is the most common one. This painting was done in 1872. The woman here represents progress, and on the right side, you can see this represents the east, probably Philadelphia with the 2 rivers. We have light from the developed side of America to the unknown, the west side. As progress spreads to the west, you see the storms, see the mountains, you can see the buffalo here. The Native Americans who are seen as in the way, essentially. Even in 1872, they knew very well aware what they were doing. And even down here, I don't know if you can tell, but it's like monsters almost. It looks like a baby bear cub with his teeth showing. But what progress is bringing is trains, right? Agriculture. Bringing agriculture, mining as well. These guys look like miners. First, eventually we will have stagecoach wagons from town to town, but first leading the way, it's got to be the pioneers. They're going to start everything leading this. Progress is heading west. This is the manifest destiny. A lot of people think this is Lady Columbia or somebody else, but no, she represents progress, which is really weird. She is carrying a telegraph wire, which shows you how important trains are, because with trains we actually can connect coast to coast and city to city by building telegraph wire along the tracks, and which makes it sense. It's actually pretty easy. This star on her head, which this is the part that's funny because nobody really understands the painter, but he says this represents the star of the empire, whatever that means. And then lastly, what's cool about this painting that people don't realize is the book in her hand is not actually the Bible. I know that's what you're thinking. Or you're thinking, oh, maybe this is perhaps the Constitution. No, it's a school book. The painter actually said it's a school book. So you only mean that he intends for the metaphor of bringing education to the West. That's the best we can deal with that. But it's pretty interesting how everything you would think you would know, there's more to it, and also it's just more complicated than what we assume. The area we're talking about, manifest destiny, we're talking about, just so we have a map here, Americans are cutting across this area here and working their way over, some over into California, which is owned by Spain up until 1821. And then eventually by 1848, Mexico would give it up to the United States. All right. But as for the time being in this chapter, we talk about Spain holding this area, and then we're going to talk about Mexico controlling that area as well. Big reason why a lot of these people would cross and make this trip over to California is the gold discovered in 1848. It brings a mass amount of people over called the 49ers, in case you're wondering who they are or where they came from. They're the 49ers is the San Francisco football team that most people can associate with, are going to be nicknamed after those first settlers that come over to California that make the trek over. They become known as the 49ers. Now, the reason for that is obviously it's 1849, but also there were people coming over before that. 1848, 5,000 people came over that year. 1849, it's 30,000 that year. There's even more after that. 1850, there's 55,000. But they're nicknamed 49ers because this is the biggest first rush of pioneers. Some do go all the way from Boston and New York area and will go all the way down the coast, all the way down to South America and then over. There are a few that do that. But for the most part, everybody does it by land. And that's just because it's way more affordable. And if you had that much money to travel from Boston to New York, you're pretty well off already. Between 1841 and 1867, roughly a 25-year time period, 350,000 Americans are going to make this trek across the Great Plains, some to California, some to Oregon, and some all the way down to Texas. Right? In the process, they're going to come across 325,000 Native Americans, and they're not all going to be killing and murdering Native Americans like we see in the movies. As a matter of fact, many of them would charge tollways and charge for ferries for crossing, and the pioneers really got more upset about having to do that than those few that didn't attack them. There were some that attacked. When you think of warring tribes like the Apache, they hold up to that stereotype pretty well. But many actually learned to make money off these settlers as they process through. Okay, as far as Hispanics in the area, they were often treated with disregard, much like Native Americans or blacks, as a second-class citizen. And the Michigan senator had said it best when he said, "We don't want you as citizens or subjects. We just want your land." Pretty much telling you to get out of the way. Brief history of this area that we're talking about, just so you understand. By 1790, only 2,500 were in California, and New Mexico had 20,000. So it was sparsely populated by 1790. And I say that because that's when America was really first starting itself as a country, was its first 13 states. By 1807, Napoleon had captured a Spanish king all the way in Europe. What does that mean over here? Well, it means the Spanish colonies over here didn't have a lot of control. Kind of didn't know what was really going on. They tried. One father tries to unite everybody to, Father Hidalgo is going to try to unite everybody to have independence from Spain, and he fails at that first attempt. But in 1820, there is another attempt that people rise up again, and essentially by 1821, we're going to see Spain is going to leave Mexico, and it has its independence. To get over these trails into Mexican territory before all this, Americans are pretty lucky. As a matter of fact, they're actually going to find out, they're going to be very lucky because they're actually going to have a help with these men called mountain men. These were fur traders, trading fur in the northwest areas here in the Rocky Mountains and farther out too along these rivers. These guys were cut off from civilization. They enjoy independence. We think burly, tough lumberjack kind of mountain man. That's what we think about when we think about these fur traders. Without their help, though, you got to argue, would these settlers been able to make it across the Rocky Mountains, especially? They want to go to California for gold. Yes, that's true. But there was another thing that led them to take this route, this dangerous route, and that was Oregon. See, all along the coastline here, there are lots of volcanoes. So Oregon has rich, fertile volcanic soil. The American government wants Americans to move over there. At this point in time, Oregon country consists of about this much, a little bit of here in Canada as well. And it was jointly ruled by both British and the Americans. But Americans want to establish dominance there. So the American government actually will promise 160 acres of land. For any settler who makes that trip on their own, get to Oregon, you get 160 acres of land, and after 4 years, it's yours. And it's good land. It's volcanic soil. It's fertile. So it's great for growing. This led to what we call now as Oregon fever. people getting that fever to go and try and make it. This is a mass migration. Most walk the 2,000-mile trek. We always see the covered wagons, like this cartoon version here. We see covered wagons like that, but that's mainly for supplies. Most people walked. They went through at least 5 pairs of shoes on a 6-month hike. When they got to Oregon, as they survived the trip with tornadoes, drought, the mountains, hostile Indians, if they survived all this, they got to Oregon and they found it was pretty, what they call primitive state. Diaries show that guys put literally Friday, October 27th, made it to Oregon City. October 28th, went to work. There was no break. It was pretty primitive there. Divorce rates soared in Oregon compared to the East back home. Women wrote, "How could my husband take me to godforsaken country?" Children wrote in their diaries how miserable and depressed their mom was and how they cursed their dad. So it's pretty interesting how even when they got to Oregon, it was still a tough situation. There's a story of how this one woman wrote back home, we're doing fine here in Oregon, those that are alive. And she made that remark because her husband and 3 kids died once they got to Oregon. They made a whole 6-month trip, and that's where they actually die. So it's even once they get there, they do have to build it up to give them credit, right? As far as the natives in this area, the government's eventually going to force natives away from the Oregon Trail, and that area will eventually become railroad, and they'll be forced away from there into specific lands, which we're talking about in just a second. I do want to point out one particular thing about these trails. Not everybody went to California or Oregon. Those are the most popular ones, but some people did actually go to Mexico, what we call nowadays Texas and Colorado. They discovered silver in Colorado, but also to claim land, right? And the most famous trail that you need to know about from this, that's often doesn't get enough credit, is the Santa Fe Trail. This trail is really important. Let me explain why. If you look at this map, if you're shipping goods or anything in from Europe to the United States, you can dock here in New York through canals. You can get goods out to the Ohio River. From the Ohio River, you can follow that all the way to the Mississippi River. There you have an option. There you can either go from Mississippi River down the Mississippi River, connect to any of these states or areas, and out to Gulf of Mexico, and you can go almost anywhere to deliver those goods, right? Or if you have a steamboat, or you paid to use a steamboat, you can go upriver, the Missouri River, get to St. Louis area here, take Santa Fe Trail all the way into Mexico. What that means is Europe and Mexico is actually connected through one route. It became possible to get goods all the way to Mexico. And in reality, probably not the same company did it. They probably sold it to another company, a store, and the store sold it to another one. But you did have the possibility to get goods all the way to Mexico, which was only possible because of Santa Fe Trail. To understand, Santa Fe Trail was so important, so popular, that the peso was a currency in Missouri. Way up here where it starts is actually the peso that was accepted, not the US dollar in Missouri. Okay, these overland trails that we talk about, whichever route these settlers would take, you do need to know that it was 2,000 miles. So many people died on the way that if you divide up the numbers of people that died on the trail, you could put a grave marker for each one every 80 yards. So think of that. Shorter than a football field, you put a grave marker. 80 yards, another grave marker. It's a lot of people over 2,000 miles. Of course, I already talked about scarcity of water. Some hostile Indians, not all of them. 6 months in covered wagons, caravans. Caravan was just a group of wagons and multiple families that did this. And then we have the numbers here. Not bigger numbers, except I want you to understand just by looking at these, you can see a huge increase all of a sudden between these two. You see a big increase here as well, but these are the first guys that come over. That's what they call the 49ers. It's the first time they see large numbers of people actually come over. While these trails are, while these people are coming over, they do conflict with Native Americans, and they do, pioneer settlers do get upset and sick of these tolls, and they are attacked. Although we always talk about how that's, I talked about earlier how that's not always the case, there were some Native American tribes that live up to a stereotype, like the Apache. They're the attacking kind, right? Makes sense. But there is a treaty. It's called the Fort Laramie Treaty. And this treaty was pretty good. It actually they actually did get 10,000 Native Americans to come together, meet for 3 weeks, and come up with an official treaty. Not like it seemed to be most of the time throughout U.S. history where you sign this treaty or else. This is actually negotiations done. There are 4 parts to this treaty. The Fort Laramie Treaty. 1, Native Americans agreed to take the government's money for all the land these pioneers were ruining, their farmlands. In return, Native Americans would stop harassing white caravans, the ones that were. They would allow federal forts to be built, like Fort Laramie. It would be built right here in the middle. It's a good stopping point, resupply area, and right near the Rocky Mountains. And the Americans also agreed that they would confine themselves to a specific area. Okay, the area land would be reserved for them, and nobody would mess with them. And later on, we're going to make those areas smaller and smaller, and we're going to call those reservations. That's how it gets. That's how reservations idea first come. We went from killing them to moving them across the Mississippi to at that point putting them on reservations, right? And you first kick them off the Oregon Trail, but then you have the Transcontinental Road coming through, so you got to kick them off that, and then eventually are going to narrow their land down more and more. There'll be some up in the north. You'll see some of them up here north, but a major part is down there in the desert area, as a matter of fact. But that's how the reservations get started. A perfect example of how dangerous this trip was for these settlers is a Donner Party. They are the results of cannibalism. And in class, I go into more details about how these guys started late. They broke an axle. They tried to take a shortcut that took 100 miles. In the end, they take this trail, and they get right here in the Sierra Nevada mountains, but it's wintertime, and they get stuck here for 5 months. And before the first month is over, they're so desperate, they're eating twigs. They're eating bones from their oxen that they killed. And eventually, when the first person dies, they will starve unless they eat that person, and they do so. So they result to what we call cannibalism. The Donner Party is a fascinating story if you actually get a chance to read. The rescue attempts took 4 tries to get them out. It was pretty horrible. In the end, the Donner father, the guy in charge of this, he was found, his body was found with his head split open. It is believed that somebody was pissed at him for taking that shortcut. One guy you do need to know about is John C. Fremont, or you can just put John Fremont on this one. He's an interesting character. He maps this part. He actually works on the military. He's going to map this part of the leg through the Great Plains all the way to the coast. At first, he just does that side, comes back, writes about the beautiful scenery, draws maps, and with his wife's help, he gets it published in newspapers all over. And these maps are widely circulated, meaning that people from all over saw his maps and his stories, and they fell in love with this land that he was talking about. And so they took those maps, and they were determined to try it as well. It was so great for him that he had enough money to take another trip and map it as well. And again, more maps means more money for him. Now, I do have on this slide, he takes a 3rd trip. He's going to take a 3rd trip with a whole bunch of armed soldiers, but that's later on in 1845 when something else is going on. But we'll come back to that, okay? Now, that is a picture of him climbing the Rocky Mountains with his skinny legs, like he skipped leg day. I don't know the story behind that drawing. It's pretty embarrassing if I was him. But nonetheless, what about politics, right? If Americans are coming over to this area, Spain and what we now call California, but at that point in time it was Mexico. If they're doing this, what are we? What's the politics behind it? What's the government doing about it? Well, Jackson and Tyler both tried to buy California and Texas from Spain, and then Spain refused to do so. But when Mexico became independent from Spain, they tried to buy it from Mexico. Mexico again refused to sell Texas and California. At this point, in 1823, there's only roughly 3,000, or there's as much as 3,000 illegal Americans in Texas alone. White settlers were coming in and just squatting on land and calling it theirs. So there were quite a big number of illegal Americans in there. As time went on, Mexico gets its independence from Spain. They're actually going to invite some Americans over. You guys remember this part from Texas history, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But yes, you do have Stephen F. Austin's 300 families coming over. But there were rules that all Americans had to follow. Mexico had made rules. Hey, if you come over, you have to become citizens, all right? And it wasn't hard. You just had to say, hey, I declare my allegiance to Mexico, and that was it, right? So not like nowadays where citizens are really difficult. That's all they had to do: become citizens, become Catholic, and do not bring slaves. They did not follow any of these at all. As a matter of fact, by 1835, there's 35,000 settlers over here with 3,000 slaves. And the Mexican government has had enough of cracking down on this idea of slavery and getting rid of it. It gets so scary, guys like Stephen F. Austin will write to a friend and says, I know now more than ever that Texas has to be a slave country. It has to be American. He said that well before these guys took up arms. Eventually, these guys will take up arms, right? Their rebels will gather up. They eventually stop at the Alamo in Santa Ana. It's just a mission. It's not a good defense at all. But in time, people or groups took over the Alamo, and when a bigger opponent came through, the opponent let them go. It was never actually like, we're going to attack and kill you here. And this has been going on back and forth for a while. But Santa Anna is a military dictator of Mexico, and just a named military dictator should tell you that he's not going to stand for these guys threatening these rebels. So he does not let them leave the Alamo. His 3,000 men will surround these 200 volunteers at the Alamo, and they will murder them, right? Kill them in battle. And of course, the famous debate is, did Davy Crockett cry and beg for mercy, or did he just die? That's what everybody pays attention to. I don't know why. But nonetheless, people aren't scared. The whole idea of Santa Anna was to scare these rebels, to make sure they realize what could happen to them. Instead, people hear one thing, and that's the famous phrase, remember the Alamo. And in March of 1836, representatives in Texas will meet together and declare independence from Mexico, just the same way Americans declared independence from Great Britain. Then they got the heck out of there because the Mexicans were coming with their army. About a month later, a guy by the name of Sam Houston, you guys all know so well, will have the Battle of San Jacinto right here outside Baytown. And in there, he will catch the Mexicans sleeping, and they will slaughter the Mexican army with a final blow. This picture is actually of Sam Houston laying on the ground because he broke his leg, and they bring Santa Anna to Sam Houston, and Santa Anna will surrender Texas. But here's the problem with that. By the time Santa Anna gets back to Mexico, he's actually been exiled. They kicked him out of government. There was a coup d'etat, if you ever heard of one of those. And the government's overthrown in Mexico, which has happened like 200 times in Mexico's history. But Santa Anna is not the legitimate ruler, so how can he surrender this land to these Texans? Secondly, there's a major dispute. Is it the Nueces River, or is it the Rio Grande River? Where is the actual border? You're thinking, what's the difference? You can actually see here the difference is quite... it's actually quite a big difference. If you take a look, we'll see that there we have the Nueces River here, and this is the Rio Grande. So all this land here was disputed. Mexico said, that's not yours. Texans said, yeah, that's us, that's ours. So that was a big dispute, if they were even legal to declare this, and was it even their territory? This guy right here, good old Sam Houston, is going to meet with this guy right here, Calhoun. Calhoun is Tyler's new Secretary of State, and Calhoun would draft a treaty to make Texas become part of the U.S., but it fails in the Senate. By the way, Jackson and Van Buren, Jackson didn't even want to fight a war with Mexico to get this, didn't care too much about it. Van Buren, during his 4 years as president, wouldn't even talk about it. It wasn't in a debate. He just pretended it never happened. He pretended Texas wasn't there and wasn't in its own country for a while. It was just easier to deal with. That's because there's a major battle going on. Like, if you add this Texas a slave state, it's going to shift the balance. Tyler and Polk, they both argued this. Yeah, Texas would become slave state, but any further expanding, any more land that we get, wouldn't have slaves because the climate won't grow cotton. So that was the argument they made. Calhoun's big mistake about this treaty was he wrote a letter to his friend about how great slavery was and how we need it. And this is a point in time in history where most people, especially in the North, were seeing how evil slavery was and didn't agree with it, especially in other countries. So this letter got out and it really killed Calhoun, and essentially his treaty falls through and the Senate would not ratify the treaty, so it not become official law. And this is what it brings us to election of 1844. That is Tyler's last go-around, essentially, is dealing with Texas. This is election 44. It's all about one thing, Texas. Should Texas become part of the United States? That was a key issue. The Whigs put up Henry Clay, still a famous guy. Clay denounces it, says we cannot do this. This is expanding slavery. This is going to cause war with Mexico. We can't do this for all these reasons. Democrats elect a guy named Polk. You never heard of him before. And he wasn't actually supposed to be the front runner. They wanted Van Buren to be the front runner, to come back and run for president again. But even though Van Buren was a Democrat, he did not support the idea of making Texas part of the United States. And so when they all got together to choose the nominee for the Democrats, nobody got 2/3 of the vote. Not until Polk volunteered and said, hey, if I get this, I will serve only one term. And part of people have argued Polk knew that his colleagues would let him do this so that they could focus on the next one, then 4 years from now. So Polk actually said, I'm just going to do one term if I'm elected, because he was picked as a vice president at first. And so Polk becomes a Democrat lead, and he has 4 things he wants to tackle. He wants to return to independence treasury, gets it done. He's going to settle the Oregon issue, gets it done. He's going to annex Texas, gets it done. He's going to get California from Mexico, gets it all done. For a one-term president, he's very successful, and he also has a really nice mullet, right? There are other pictures of him without a mullet, but I like that one better. Now, before Polk takes over, the Texas thing's kind of done for him. President Tyler was not elected. He wasn't even chosen by his party, so he couldn't even run for re-election. He may not have been re-elected, but that was November. He still has till March before he's out of office. And he asked Congress to pass a joint resolution. A joint resolution is almost like, it's for show. Like, they make joint resolutions condemning a person for doing something, or the Congress might have a joint resolution where they vote to send their condolences to the Queen of England after her son died, something like that, right? Only a majority of Congress is needed. It's not law-abiding like a treaty, but it pretty much says that, hey, we plan on doing this, and this is our route. So Tyler asked for a joint resolution. His final act was to sign that resolution, and then by February of the following year, it kind of trickles down, and it's decided, like, this is close enough, we'll take this, and Texas would lower their flag and raise the U.S. flag and say we're now part of America. Kind of sketchy. If it sounds sketchy, it is sketchy. By that point in time, there's 1,000 white settlers and 38,000 slaves in Texas, and Mexico looks at this act by United States because they went farther than just recognize Texas. They actually made Texas part of their country, and Mexico dispatches troops to the border of the Rio Grande. While all this is going on, you still have another issue to deal with, and that's Oregon country, right? This area was divided, the British and America ruling it together, co-ruling, but Americans are begging for war. Americans want this land. As a matter of fact, Polk doesn't want to start this war. But luckily for him, Great Britain doesn't want to go to war with something so stupid like Oregon. And Great Britain says, let's just draw the line in the middle. You can have it. And so that's actually how that border is finally established. And if you want to know the mood, the feeling you're starting to see from America, you can look no farther than the New York Herald. That newspaper said, now we can thrash Mexico into decency at our leisure. This was a very pro-war America at the time. The saying is 54-40 or war. So the Mexican-American War, how does that officially happen? Well, Polk doesn't want to start the war. He says, we're not going to fire the first shot. Polk actually wants a smaller war because he doesn't want a commander in charge of the army getting too popular and eventually running against Polk later. Okay, so Polk had the whole plan to run again, but he's going to change his mind once after this war. He actually will change his mind. But Polk doesn't want to start the war, so instead he sends a guy by the name of Zachary Taylor to build a fort on the Rio Grande, on the border of Rio Grande. This provokes an attack. It's always a debate. Some people say the Mexico forces crossed over the Rio Grande and attacked Americans, killed 11 Americans, and then took the rest of the prisoner of wars back to Mexico. Others have argued that Americans crossed the border of the Rio Grande and Mexicans chased them back and fought them there. So there's always been a debate, but nonetheless, Polk was waiting for this ever since he sent Taylor to build the fort, so much that Polk had his declaration of war already ready, and he asked Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress grants him. And like that, America has declared war on Mexico. Now, opposition to this war, famous guys you heard of, John Quincy Adams, well-respected man in the North, said this was unrighteous. This guy right here, you might recognize him as a young Abraham Lincoln. This point in time, he's barely a House of Representative. He introduces spot resolutions. He has a map. He says, President, Mr. President, show me where. Where is the blood spilled? Because I don't think it was spilled in America. I think it was on the other side in Mexico, and you're just using this for a chance to start war. Imagine Lincoln nowadays would have been called unpatriotic for that. But the later on founding president of the Republican Party actually did not agree with that war at all. Henry Clay fears this is going to break the Union. The United States is going to fall apart. And that's because the North said this is all about slavery. The North knew that this is all about you wanting to expand slavery. But in the West and the South, people loved it because it meant more land, more cotton, and it was more economic opportunity for them. Now, the battle itself. This is going to take over 4 fronts, right? New Mexico, California, Texas, and Mexico. It's a 2-year war. It's a very short war. Got 2 guys in charge, right? California goes pretty simple. California is actually really interesting. Remember I told you guys how John C. Fremont made a 3rd march? He actually marches his men all the way to California. He gets a secret telegraph from Polk about starting a revolution, getting people worked up, and he does do that. They actually raise a flag declaring their official republic. This is the flag at the bottom. Later on, it will become a state flag as well. The bear and the star, if you've ever seen that, that's a state flag of California. The problem with Fremont doing this is when Fremont gets there, it turns out one commander had took the U.S. Navy, and he was actually waiting for this. Once the fighting broke out in the Rio Grande, he took his warships straight to California and waited. It was directed by Polk to be ready just in case. And he starts attacking like San Francisco, other waterways. He'll eventually give command to Stockton in the army, and he's going to control these armies. But then there's a guy named Kearny marches into California as well. And now you have a big showdown. Who's in charge, Kearny or Stockton? Kearny didn't understand this. John C. Fremont, when he gets there, he said, hey, Stockton's got it. I'll back him. So Stockton says, yeah, thanks, buddy. Now you're governor of California. And Fremont starts issuing orders and all these rules and laws right away. While this whole time, Kearny is like really confused. He's like, Polk said I was in charge. So Polk has Fremont arrested and sends him back west to face court-martial. Kearny was just higher ranking and was able to do that. So Fremont is known for that. Fremont's so embarrassed by this, he's so mad that he quits the army, comes back to California, and becomes one of their first senators, actually. But that trial of Fremont being put on was like the biggest trial since Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Everybody was paying attention to this guy and what he had done. Okay, the war starts off pretty basic. The United States is not ready for war like they usually aren't at this time. They only have 75,000 soldiers versus Mexico's 32,000. But Americans that generation was wanting war. By the end of the war, that 7,000 grew to 79,000. 31,000 of those were state militia, volunteer forces with no morals. They raped, looted, and plundered. No command whatsoever. They just did whatever they wanted. They were a bunch of reckless soldiers. And Mexico itself, they were forced. A lot of people in the Mexican army was forced into it because they were poor or they were prisoners and forced to fight. Mexico actually weapons were more obsolete. Remember, Mexico just barely became independent in 1821. Now you're talking less than 20 years later, they have a full force of America coming at them. So they're just less prepared even than the Americans, right? Now, to explain who's in charge first, because this gets confusing. First in command is Taylor. If you actually look at this map, it shows Taylor landing here. Matamoros has a 5-day battle in Monterrey, right? At this point in time, Taylor has made that far with his troops, and there is rumor that Santa Anna, who was exiled and sent to Cuba, has contacted Polk. He's made contact with President Polk. Santa Anna told him, hey, you get me back into Mexico, I can get Mexico to surrender underneath your terms. You'll enjoy this. You'll like it. Polk tells Taylor, get him in there, get him to his people. And Santa Anna actually is really good about raising armies. He's very charismatic. His men love him. And Santa Anna gets to Mexico, and he raises a giant army, bigger than Taylor's at the time. And he tells Taylor, you can surrender now. Taylor tells him, you go to hell. and they have the Battle of Buena Vista. Kind of bad. Taylor was told not to actually do this battle. Polk had told him not to do it. But what was crazy about it is like Mexicans suffered 5 times the loss at Buena Vista. Santa Anna's not good at fighting battles, but he's really good about getting people behind him to fight them. But both sides claimed victory. But after this, Mexico would lose battle after battle. This is a pretty bad one for them. But nonetheless, whenever offers were sent for a treaty, Mexico says no, 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 no. Polk, as president, is sick and tired of it, so he puts another guy in charge, Scott. So Scott is now in charge. Scott is told to land in Veracruz, and there you see Veracruz right here. Scott lands in Veracruz and attacks and marches. It's actually the same route to Mexico City that Cortez took against the Aztecs 300 years before this, almost 350 years before this. Cortez took the same march to Mexico City. Now, when Polk does this and conquers Mexico City, it's actually pretty remarkable. The guys who beat Napoleon in England, in Europe, they actually said, when they heard about Scott doing this, they laughed and said, he's going to get beat so bad. First, Veracruz is the most fortified, it's like a huge fortress, strongest fortress in North America. But also, the defenses to Mexico City were huge, grand. But in 4 unique battles, Scott's able to defeat Mexico and its defenders and captures the title. People in Europe would then say he's one of the greatest soldiers of all time. It is important to hear, if you do know some of the history, some guys that do end up fighting with Mexico that were originally United States soldiers were part of what's called St. Patrick's Battalion. These are actually Irish Catholics who try to fight for America but were mistreated because they're Catholic and because they're Irish, felt uncertainty, and ended up with fighting for Mexico. This is a really cool song about these, St. Patrick's Battalion. If you ever see close relations between Irish and Mexico, this is where it comes into hand. When these guys are actually caught by the American side, they're hung. In Mexico, outside Mexico, when one find a battle, they raise a flag and they give the command to hang 30 of these guys. And it was so bad that one of the men that they hung actually had both his legs amputated. And the doctor told him, said, hey, this guy suffered from battle so much, this Irish guy, both his legs were amputated. And the general at the time said, by God, I said I was going to hang 30, I'm going to hang 30 of these men. They don't ever capture all these guys. They're going to hang 30 there, 50 before that, a different battle they hang. They actually brand, which means they heat up the letter D and brand it into their face for deserter. And some will find refuge in Mexico for to live a life. But the St. Patrick's Battalion, it's an interesting story if you look at that. And mainly they went over because some of them felt morally obligated the way Mexicans were being treated by Americans, but also Americans were treating them horrible because they were Catholic. And Irish Catholics sided with the Mexican Catholics, giving their common religious background. So that's how the war ends. Mexico City is captured. This introduces the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Ooh, I did that terrible, sorry. But nonetheless, this is going to give all this land to America. And in turn, $15 million is giving to the Mexican government. $15 million. Technically, Texas is given, but this land is $15 million given for this land. If you want to know if that's a good deal, not for Mexico, because later on, Americans will buy this little piece in a straight up non-war-like way for like $10 million. But that's a little bit later. But just to show you how horrible the deal was. Now, there is a legacy with this war in America. It brings a surge in national pride. Like, people were super proud of the way of that American flag. Even though only roughly 2,000 were killed in action, 4,000 were wounded, almost 12,000 actually died from disease. And that disease included Montezuma's revenge. If you've never heard of that, look it up. It's pretty miserable. But also, not just a surge in national pride, this war was short. It was a 2-year war. Most of the war was spent traveling, getting people ready, mobilizing for the war, than actual fighting in the war. And so it was short and quick and easy. So the next war, Americans had that same idea. This would be a short, quick war. That war later on, 15 years, would be the Civil War. The Civil War would be the next war America fights in 1860. And this was several firsts in this war, right? First, we have a successful Imperial American War. Literally, America expanded to take land. This is the first time they've ever done that, to become an empire. First time they occupy enemy capital. Every other war before this, War of 1812, American Revolution, it was a defensive war. First time West Point grads play a huge role. These are your engineers, right? We talk about how engineering was so important. Engineers played a huge role in this battle. You also have your first war correspondents. Those are reporters, journalists, who report what's going on and get message back and let everybody know. It's the first time we have that. Okay, so there's a lot of firsts in the Mexican-American War. But even more so, it's pretty interesting when we look at this, that we also see a big problem arise. Some famous names that are going to fight side by side and get to know each other's tactics, get to know each other pretty well. You have guys that get experience like Robert E. Lee. You may have heard of him. Ulysses Grant, right? We got Robert E. Lee is going to end up being a Confederate leader. Grant will be the leaders of the Union. Stonewall Jackson, huge first right-hand man of Lee. McClellan was a general in the North. Meade was a general in the North. All these guys got their experience and became familiar with each other's fighting style from the Mexican-American War. That was really important, and that is also why the Civil War was much more bloodier and much more difficult for both sides.